Shape of organic molecules. So the shape of a molecule is really its function. If you have a molecule that fits in a cell, so let's say this is the cell, and there's a molecule with a very special shape. Let's say it lets sodium ions in, and here are all the sodium ions that need to go in. If the shape of this is wrong, then the sodium ions won't fit through it. Maybe the shape will fold it in a different way, and so it will be too small. Now the sodium ions can't go in, and that is one of the problems you have with cystic fibrosis. The sodium doesn't go in, and so a bunch of goop or mucus lines the outsides of cells, especially in lungs, and that's a problem. So the shape of organic molecules is super important to their function. Each type of organic molecule has a unique three-dimensional shape. So when you look at this stuff, it looks like they're flat, but you can see this one is going backwards over to this one. So they have this 3D shape, and it's really important for their function. The shape determines its function in an organism. What we're going to talk about next are functional groups. So we talked about this carbon skeleton in our last segment, and so the carbon skeleton means you've got carbon to carbon to carbon. Maybe this forms a long chain, or maybe it forms a ring of some sort. But you remember there can be 2 bonds coming off of each one over here like this. So there are 4 bonds on each carbon. And a functional group is a group that's sticking out that would be something besides just the carbon to carbon to carbon. So an example might be that there would be nitrogen sticking off one, and so the nitrogen would be bound to maybe a couple of hydrogens like this. Pretend that's a hydrogen. Or carbon could be bound to an oxygen, which is then bound to a hydrogen. That's another functional group. These functional groups, I'm not going to have you memorize the different ones, but the functional groups give a certain function to the molecule. So for example, this is the hydroxyl group, and the shape of this is bent, and it ends up happening that this side is a little bit more negative, and so that actually mixes with water really well. So now all of a sudden you have a molecule that mixes with water instead of a molecule that shuns water. So this functional group adds a whole new function to this skeleton that you had, the carbon skeleton. So a functional group is a group of atoms or groups of atoms that give properties to the compounds to which they attach. So here's one example. Hydroxyl is one of the functional groups. You actually do not need to memorize the different functional groups for me. You just need to understand that functional groups change the carbon skeleton. They change the function. So functional groups change the function of the molecule. This is the hydroxyl group, and it's drawn linearly, but really what happens, the carbon is bound to oxygen like it's shown, and then that hydrogen is actually bent like this. So instead of having a molecule, this would be ethane if it just had the hydrogen, I believe. Now you add this OH, and instead of being hydrophobic, now it's hydrophilic. It mixes with water really well, so it's got a totally brand new function to it. So that's a hydroxyl group. Another group is the carboxyl group. That's when you have a carbon double bound to an oxygen and then to an OH, or you can have it be to an O, and then if you get rid of the H, you've just taken away the proton. If you leave the electron, it would be an O negative, so that would also work for a carboxyl group. Anyway, this will also change the function of the molecule. Here's another group. It's called the amino group. The amino group is when you have your carbon skeleton, and that's attached to a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. You can also have it attached to, so the nitrogen can also be attached to 3 hydrogens. So in this case, you would have the hydrogen with its electron, but it would be a positive charge. And if you look at it, here's a nitrogen, and it's got 3 bonds. Typically, this would be to some carbon skeleton, and then you've got your hydrogen and your hydrogen. If you have a proton come over, meaning a hydrogen atom that's a positively charged one, one of the double, so this would have, in its outer shell, it would have 1, 2, because it's shared electrons, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then it has its own already 7, 8 electrons. If these come and share with hydrogen, then you would have a positive charge, because the hydrogen, if it's a hydrogen ion and it didn't bring over its own electron, then it could share electrons with these 2 that were already part of nitrogen. So anyway, way more than you need to know, but I just don't want you to be confused when you see H3. That's actually still the same functional group, the amino group, the NH2 or the NH3 positive, same thing. Anyway, you don't have to know anything about the amino group really, except that the amino group gives you a different function. And actually, there is one thing you should remember about it. The amino group is found in amino acids, which you might know are part of proteins. And this is the nitrogen that you find in proteins. And so that is going to become important. In a few more video segments, I'll show you um, the elements that are in the different organic molecules. And protein has the amino groups in it, and so they've got nitrogen. Okay, quiz time. This is a quiz time for this section and the section that came right before this, the organic molecules number 1. So this molecule has which functional groups? Again, it's not super important that you remember the functional groups, but let's see if you can do it. So this, you can pause this because I'm about to give you the answers. Pause it, think of it yourself, and then see if you're right. This group is the amino group, so that would be this one. And this group has a C, O, and it could be OH, or if you lose the H, that means you're losing a proton, a positive charge, which is what the hydrogen ion is. And that leaves behind its electron, so that would leave it negative. So that's actually a carboxyl group too. Hydroxyl group is OH, and without the C double bond to O, and so that's not present here. So carboxyl and amino. This molecule has which functional groups? So out of the functional groups that we've talked about, so it has OH, and so that is the hydroxyl group. And out of the ones we've studied, that's all there is. This molecule has which functional groups? Choose all that apply. So this one is the COOH. So that is the carboxyl group, and that looks like it. The rest is just a carbon-hydrogen skeleton. This molecule has which functional groups? So we haven't talked about the phosphate group. This is actually a really important group, and this is found in DNA, and it gives the DNA phosphorus in it as well. So we don't need to, that one's not on the list, but it is an important functional group. Here you have NH2, and so that's your amino group. Here you have OH, and you've got a bunch of those, so that's your hydroxyl group. Carboxyl is CO and an OH, and I don't see that anywhere. So just these two out of the ones that we've covered. And we're going to stop with this one.